We will start now with this first talk about the Mekong, its fish, its fisheries, with a lot of photos so that you can get a perception of how different the Mekong is in its different regions, and also what are the key elements, the key ecological and human elements, in particular in Cambodia. So the outline of the presentation is first the main features of the Mekong, and then we will have this photographic tour from the mountains of Tibet down to Vietnam. And then we shall talk about the Cambodian Mekong and its fish, how the fish depends on hydrology, what is their ecology, and other environmental aspects, and the fishing aspects. And this will lead to a few summaries, a few conclusions. The main features of the Mekong River, talking about hydrology, fish biodiversity, fisheries. The Mekong flows in 6 countries. The upper Mekong flows in China and a little bit in Burma. And then in the lower Mekong basin, that is Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. You can see here in black the borders, the boundaries of the watershed, which defines where a drop of water will fall during the rain. If it falls within the boundaries, it will end up in the Mekong River. And if the water drop from the rain falls outside the boundaries, it will end up in another water basin. The Mekong Delta starts in Phnom Penh, because this is where the river starts splitting into many branches before reaching the sea. So the first split is between the main Mekong and the Tonle Basak. Incidentally, Ho Chi Minh City is not in the Mekong Basin, it is in the Saigon River Basin. The slope of the Mekong is very different depending on the country. The Mekong starts in the Himalaya with a very steep slope, which means that there is a lot of power in the water flowing. It makes it very relevant for hydropower production. And in this place, the Mekong is narrow, but also full of rocks and flowing between a valley. But then it slows down, which you will see will influence the morphology of the river, reaching Vientiane, and then Con Falls. And Con Falls is a threshold, is the end of the substantial slope, and then we reach the Cambodian floodplains, and there the Mekong is much slower, much bigger as well, and much more muddy. In terms of hydrology, the Mekong is the 10th longest river in the world, the first one being the Nile River in Africa. And it's also the 14th biggest river in the world, the first one being the Amazon. But the Mekong is the first river in terms of hydrological variability between the flood season and the dry season. It is the river that varies most in the world. This hydrological variability creates a lot of flooding during the wet season, as you can see here, but also in Laos and Thailand. In Cambodia, 20% of the country is flooded every year. This creates a drastic change in the landscape, as you're familiar with the dry season floodplain environment being progressively flooded and then fully flooded during the rainy season, with the flooded forest that contributes a lot to the richness, to the trophic nature of these waters and to the production of fish. In terms of diversity, the Mekong is characterized by a very high species richness, around 1,000 fish species. 781 have been precisely described, and the total count might reach 1,200. And another characteristic of this fish is that migrations are very important among them. 87% of the species are migratory, either over long distances or local migrations, but they don't spend all their time in the same habitat. And at least 165 species are long-distance migrants over several hundred kilometers. In Cambodia, more than half of the catch is made of long-distance migrants. In fact, this reflects the fact that a lot of fish species depend on flooded areas for food and reproduction, but when these flooded areas get dry, they need to move to another habitat during the dry season. How does this fish biodiversity compares with the rest of the world? Actually, the Mekong is the second river in the world for its number of fish species after the Amazon River. And the Tonle Sap Lake is the fourth lake in the world for its species richness, after three East African big lakes. This biodiversity is reflected by giant species like the Mekong giant catfish, the giant stingray, the giant carp, and also at the other end of the range, a minuscule fish whose size is 2.5 centimeters maximum as adults, and they are found in rice fields. When you look at the species diversity by sub-basin, you find a gradient from upstream to downstream. Few species upstream, like 24 species in China, in Tibet, coming down to 48 species maximum, and then increasingly more and more, with a lot of species in Thailand, a lot of species in the Tonle Sap, and the highest number of species in the Mekong Delta. This also results from the fact that species from the sea paying a visit inside the delta are also accounted for. So in short, what characterizes aquatic ecology in the lower Mekong Basin is a very high species richness, a lot of wetlands, and a lot of fish migrations. In terms of total fish catch, there are two different perspectives. Either we compare national statistics, the bars in green here, and you can see the production of the Mekong countries compared to the production of other countries in the world on different continents, either inland catch only or marine plus inland catch. By all means, the inland catch in the Mekong countries is extremely high. But if we consider the assessments of the Mekong River Commission, then the catch is even much higher and reaches 2.6 million tons every year, even though there is no regular annual monitoring to observe a trend. We're reaching now the moment of a tour of the Mekong from Tibet to the Delta. The trip starts in Tibet, and this is what the Mekong looks like in its northern part. In winter, we are at about 5,000 meters altitude. The river is very small, very narrow, very deep into a valley. You can see its size here in proportion to the size of a person here. The landscape is beautiful and characterized by a very special ethnic diversity and Tibetan people in particular. Then we move to the southern part of the Upper Mekong at the border between China and Laos. We are now in Luang Prabang. The Mekong is much wider, calmer as well. Still within the mountains, but the mountains are not that high. And the navigation is full of obstacles. A number of these obstacles have been blasted in the past years in order to facilitate the navigation and the trade between China and Thailand or Laos. The region is also characterized by an extremely high diversity, ethnic diversity, with the people of the Golden Triangle. We're now moving downstream at the level of Thailand. The river is more flat now, which you can see from its size, from its slope, from the appearance of islands. But it's still pretty rocky and it's still very navigable. And the settlements, human settlements, have been around for thousands of years. This is considered 3,000 to 5,000 years old. It's a painting in a cave in Thailand, and it features paintings of the giant Mekong catfish. These giant fishes are praised and recognized in Thailand, as illustrated by a number of festivals. We're now reaching Khon Falls at the border between Laos and Cambodia. Khon Falls is very special because the Mekong here becomes braided between many different branches, creating many islands. The Lao name is Sipandon, which means 4,000 islands, as you can see from this picture. And this is an area with many channels. There is a fall of about 8 meters between Laos and Thailand. It's a place of tremendous fishing methods. A number of them are vanishing, but they used to be extremely spectacular in very difficult conditions, as you can see here. We're now reaching Cambodia, the Great Lake, its floodplains. As you can see here from Snook Tru at the mouth of the Tonle Sap Lake in the dry season. You can see here the flooded forest in the wet season. And in the Tonle Sap, 13% of the water comes from rainfall, 30% originates from tributaries, the rivers that flow inside the lake, and almost 60% of the water comes from the Mekong River. Keep in mind that 60% of the Tonle Sap water is Mekong water. So when we're talking about damming, that has an influence on water in the Tonle Sap. The Tonle Sap is also characterized by a number of floating villages, as you can see here in Kampong Lung, and used to be characterized by gigantic inland fisheries that got decommissioned over the years. But still there is fishing in an environment that could look like the seaside, but it is the lake, and the lake is not very deep. The depth is about 1 to 2 meters maximum in the dry season. You can see people here walking on the bottom, and the depth reaches 5 to 8 meters in the rainy season. The catch is very concentrated in the Tonle Sap River, and the giant fish used to be pretty common, but now become very rare. And the size of fishing gears used to be proportional to this fish abundance, even though it is less and less the case. The total harvest that contributes very substantially to the nutrition of Cambodian people, even nowadays. And this abundance is largely reflected in the carvings of Angkor Wat Temple. As you can see in many places, the abundance of fish, the abundance of aquatic life. We're now reaching the Mekong Delta, characterized by many channels, wide and slow channels, very wide branches of the river, in Vietnam in particular, big navigation, deep channels, but also a lot of irrigation, farming, rice farming, and fish farming in the delta using the Mekong water. Interestingly, the Mekong, since it's flowing into the sea, influences the coastal area on a very large extent. As you can see here in blue, all this area in blue is influenced by Mekong waters, which means that the Mekong flows here, and depending on the season, the waters go back north or turns around the Vietnamese peninsula, the Camao Peninsula, and come back into Cambodia towards Kep and Sihanoukville, where they contribute to enriching the production of the coastal zone along Sihanoukville province and along the coast in Cambodia. Let's move now to the Cambodian Mekong and its fish resources. In other words, the different parameters, the different factors that influence fish production in the Mekong in Cambodia. Basically, the fish production in Cambodia depends on the hydrology of the river, but also on the aquatic environment, on the ecology of fish, in particular their migrations, and on the presence of multiple fishers and their fishing activity. Let's detail this step by step in the following slides. In terms of hydrology in the Cambodian Mekong, the fish production depends every year on the area flooded. When the flood is higher, more surface area is flooded and the fish production is bigger on this year. The fish production also depends on the duration of the flood. When the flood lasts longer, the fish have more time to grow and get bigger. The fish production depends also on the timing of the flood. When the flood starts earlier, the young fish have more time to grow, the survival is better, and the fish catch in the end is also better during that year. In terms of ecology, I mentioned migrations already, and there are three main migration zones in the Mekong. In the lower Mekong system, represented here in green, and passing through partly through Con Falls and extending a little bit up to Vientiane. The production is huge, with more than 700,000 tons, 7 to 900,000 tons of migratory fish. Then you have upstream of Con Falls here the lower Mekong system with a lot of floodplains and rivers and tributaries in Laos and Thailand. And then you have the upper Mekong system, where the production here is very limited. In this very steep part of the river, of the narrow river, there are not so many fish, not so many species, and also not so much fishing. In terms of space in Cambodia in particular, we can distinguish three types of fishes that ecologists call guilds of species. One is blackfish, because their color is mainly dark, like the snakehead, and they have no migrations or very short distance migrations, let's say to simplify between 0 and 10 kilometers around maximum within the floodplains, which means that these fish spend the dry season within the floodplains. They try to find a refuge or to bury in the mud. Then you have another category of fish nicknamed greyfish, with medium distance migrations. When the floodplain dries up, these fish try to migrate back into local tributaries like Stangsen, Stangchinit, Stangsanke, and spend the dry season in these tributaries. And then you have a third group of whitefish, very silvery, like Trereel, like Henicorhynchus, and these fish undertake long-distance migrations between 100 and 1,000 kilometers in the main Mekong. Migrations are also multiple in time. If we look at an example from Contfoils, we find that migration we can consider the year start in October when the water level recedes, and in November you have the first migrations going upstream. They are the migrations of large and medium-sized cyprinids. They are followed by the migrations of very small cyprinids like Henicorhynchus, Trereel, and these fish tend to follow the moon and to migrate by batches by following the moon. At the same time, a little later, you have the early migrations of medium-sized cyprinids. Then during the dry season, there are no migrations almost, and the migrations resume in April with very large cyprinids, followed by small pangasids, small catfishes, followed themselves by large catfishes. All these fishes are migrating up, and during the wet season, when the water level becomes very high, then you have a migration back of all these species and other species from upstream that migrate downstream. Fish migrations are also influenced by hydrological triggers. In other words, the sudden changes in water level that constitute a signal for fish to start a migration. And this could be observed in the past. Every time at the end of the dry season when the water level would start rising, then a migration pulse could be observed for some fish species. However, nowadays these hydrological triggers are getting reduced for multiple reasons, partly dam, partly climate change, and the fish are not that triggered anymore by such changes in water level, because these changes are less abrupt, less brutal than before. Let's review now the main environmental aspects of the Cambodian Mekong and of its fish. From a fish and fisheries perspective, the most important environmental aspect by far is the development of dams, hydropower dams, all over the basin. In year 2000, there used to be 16 hydropower dams in the whole basin, and this number will increase up to 77 dams very soon, in a few years from now, and there are plans for 136 more projects. with a total reaching more than 200 dams in the lower Mekong basin only. The average height of these dams currently in operation reaches 51 meters, which corresponds to a 16th-floor building. What is the impact of these dams? You can see here an illustration of fish in a river, and when these fish are subject to dams, even if these dams have a fish pass, and if you assume a 50% passage rate at each dam, thanks to the fish ladder, which is a very optimistic passage rate because usually it's way below 10%. But if you assume 50%, you start with 100 fish. After the first dam, you only have 50 fish left. After the second dam, you only have 25 fish left. And after the third dam, there are only 12 fish left. So depending on the number of dams the fish are subject to, you can see how many fish will succeed in completing their migration. These upstream developments, they store water officially during the rainy season, also, in fact also a bit during the dry season, and as a consequence they modify the surface area flooded. So there are different scenarios depending on the number of dams, but all these scenarios agree that they will reduce the surface area flooded. These dams also slow down the flooding and result in floods arriving later, between 2 and 12 days later, which corresponds to a later migration starting. Upstream dams also shorten the duration of the flood. You can see here that in a number of places the flood will be reduced by a substantial number of days depending on the location. The dams upstream substantially reduce the amount of sediments arriving to the lake. The water will be clearer, will be less muddy, but that's not good for fish production. And these dams, by slowing down the water, also reduce hydrological triggers, which is a phenomenon that we can already see in confalls, where fishermen say that a number of species do not try to migrate through the falls anymore because they don't perceive the flow difference from day to day. A few more words about sediment, because this is a very important parameter that gets usually overlooked. First, some background information. Sediment is composed of mineral particles like sand and mud that carries nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and others. And these nutrients contribute to the growth of vegetals, including algae and plankton, phytoplankton initially. However, there are multiple studies that show that dam development, combining with climate change, because the two impacts add up, are expected to result in a reduction of sediment load in the Mekong water, a reduction of 60 to 96%. The latter figure is dramatic and corresponds to a total filtration of the mud and the sand in the river, resulting in blue waters downstream. But in turn, this reduction in sediment load will result in a reduction in nutrients input, a reduction by 47 to 84%, which means a water much less nutritious than before, which in turn implies a reduction of 30 to 38% of the net primary production. And as a consequence, if there is less primary production, there will be less fisheries production. By 2030, dams alone are expected to reduce the sediment load at the level of the delta by at least 50%. This means a very serious impact on the Mekong Delta as a whole, because the delta results from an equilibrium between coastal erosion that takes the sediment away into the sea and the replenishment of these sediments by the river. But in that case, the sediments being retained by dams, there will be less replenishment and a progressive erosion and sinking of the delta, which is already observed in many places in Vietnam. In addition to dams, fish and fish production is subject to built structures, to constructions in floodplains. You can see here a photo near Siem Reap, and with the construction of a road. And without that road, the fish would migrate and spread throughout the floodplain. But after the road construction, the fish will stay in one area only of the floodplain, the one in direct connection with the river. Another important element in terms of environment is the floodplain vegetation. When the flooded forest is intact, it is a habitat for multiple species and a more intense production. Fish production resulting from a higher original primary production. But when the vegetation is less developed, in the case of a grassland, you have less species and less abundance. And if there is no vegetation, in the case of barren land, then you have no more habitats for fish, no food for fish, and much less production and much less biodiversity. Last, one element of importance in Cambodia in particular is the presence of dry season refuges. In the floodplains, when the flood recedes, here the fish tend to aggregate in ponds and lakes, small lakes, when some others go back to the river. You remember the blackfish and the whitefish. So the blackfish spend the dry season in these refuges, and when the water comes back with the next flood, then the blackfish spread again in the floodplain. But if the ponds are reclaimed for construction, or if they are pumped dry for fishing, then there is no more dry season habitats, and this also has an impact on fish production. Now you remember we talked about hydrology, we just talked now about environment. Let's talk about fisheries. Overall, in all fisheries of the world, there is a tendency for a reduction of big fish that are usually carnivorous, and the remaining fish are smaller and smaller, and they are increasingly planktophagous. They eat plankton. And this is a trend you can see in Cambodia already. This is a phenomenon you can witness in Cambodia with this photo taken at the same place on the Tonle Sap Lake 20 years ago, with a fair abundance of medium-sized fish. And nowadays you don't find these medium-sized fish anymore. They have been replaced by very small-sized fish that are good for prahok only. So reduction in fish size. But also you can see in the catch a replacement of some species by other species. In general, the larger fish have declined. We have several years of monitoring here in the upper Mekong between Kampong Cham and Stang Treng. And these large fish have declined over the years, but some other species have appeared and become dominant in catches. But these fish, these dominant species, are the species that react very quickly to the flood. If the flood is good, they multiply and they become abundant. But if the flood is bad, they collapse. So that triggers a change over from year to year, from more or less stable catches to catches that are increasingly variables, with sometimes very good years. It's with a high catch, but it's a high catch of small fish, and some very bad years with no catch. As a consequence, the giant fish species I mentioned before, like the giant catfish or the giant carp, are for some almost extinct and for some endangered or critically endangered. Let's conclude this presentation by a brief summary in 2 slides. This first slide is a summary of what we have just seen about fish production in Cambodia, its influence in the Mekong by hydrology, that is the water level every year, the duration of the flood, and the timing of the flood. These 3 parameters drive the fish production. But the fish production is also conditioned by the environment, in particular the presence or not of dams and built structures, the nature and abundance of the flooded vegetation, and the quantity of refuges available in the dry season. The fish production in Cambodia is also largely influenced by fish migrations, to what extent they are possible. And last, fishing yields the fish production. It is thanks to fishermen that we have fish on markets. But fishing influences the size of fish and the nature of dominant species. If we zoom out to the scale of the whole Mekong basin, we can say that one of the main features of the Mekong River is the very high flow variability, which creates seasonal floodplains and wetlands. These are temporary habitats, very favorable habitats for fish. That also combines with the presence of large tributaries in Cambodia, Thailand, Laos. Migrations can happen then from and to these tributaries into the Mekong. And third, the Mekong is very long, up to the Tibetan region, and includes mountain streams with again different and very specific habitats. So altogether, that creates really a diversity of habitats, but that also combines with the very large river basin, and we previously saw that large river basins are characterized all over the world by a high diversity. And also, it's a large river basin in the tropical area, which also corresponds to a high biodiversity. This is why we are here dealing with the second richest river in the world. This fish biodiversity contributes to the very high fish abundance, together with multiple habitats available. And this abundance of fish is influenced by the very high flow variability to create large-scale fish migrations. The fish cannot stay in one single place because the flow varies too much. This is why we have so many large-scale fish migration in the Mekong. Then at another level, you have intensive fishing with a high population, multiple methods, and that creates the first inland fishery in the world. And subsequently, that fishery is very important for food security. You may have a very high fish abundance and flow variability in other rivers of the world, like the Amazon, but then the population is not so high along the Amazon River, the fishing intensity is not so high, and the river is not so important for food security. In the Mekong, it is. So ultimately, you have a combination of a river important for food security and a importance of large-scale fish migrations, and dams obstruct these fish migrations. This is why, unfortunately, the Mekong is a case where dams have the most impact on food security. This will be the last slide of our presentation. I hope it summarizes a number of issues, and I would like to thank you for your attention. Dear professors and students, thank you again, and see you soon for the other conferences of this series. Bye bye.